Money can't buy everything, but it can certainly hide the truth. When 68-year-old business mogul Richard Blackwell collapsed in his marble-floored office, clutching his chest and gasping for air, everyone thought they knew what was killing him. The doctors spoke of stress, poor diet, and the inevitable toll of building an empire worth $300 million. His family whispered about the pressure of maintaining his reputation as one of the city's most successful real estate developers. But Marcus Chen, a single father working the night shift as a janitor in Blackwell's downtown office building, would soon discover that sometimes the deadliest poison isn't found in the bloodstream or the medicine cabinet. Sometimes it lives in the shadows of guilt, fed by decades of silence, and nurtured by the very wealth that was supposed to protect you from harm. What Marcus found that cold December evening, hidden behind a false wall in Blackwell's private office, would not only save a dying man's life, but expose a 30-year-old secret that had been slowly killing him from the inside out. This is the story of how a janitor's curiosity, a father's intuition, and an old photograph changed everything for two men who thought they had nothing in common except the building where one worked and the other was slowly dying. Marcus Chen had been cleaning office buildings for 12 years, but he had never seen a man cry at 3 in the morning while sitting behind a desk worth more than most people's houses. Through the glass wall of the executive office on the 42nd floor, he watched Richard Blackwell stare at something in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to echo through the empty hallway despite the soundproof walls. It was December 15th, and the city below sparkled with early Christmas lights. But inside Blackwell Tower, the atmosphere felt heavy with something Marcus couldn't name. He had been working this building for 8 months now, ever since his previous job cleaning office buildings downtown had ended when the company downsized. As a single father to 10-year-old Emma, Marcus couldn't afford to be picky about work schedules. The night shift paid 20% more, and it meant he could be home when Emma got back from school, help her with homework, and make sure she had dinner before Mrs. Rodriguez from next door came over to watch her while he worked. Marcus pushed his cleaning cart quietly down the hallway, trying not to disturb whatever private moment was happening behind those glass walls. He had learned early in his career that wealthy people often forgot that janitors were human beings with eyes and ears. They would have phoned conversations about million-dollar deals while he emptied their wastebaskets, or discussed family problems while he vacuumed around their feet. Most of the time, Marcus preferred it that way. He wasn't paid to get involved in other people's business, and he had enough problems of his own. But something about the scene in Blackwell's office bothered him. In the 8 months he had been cleaning this floor, he had observed the man's habits. Blackwell typically left his office by 8 in the evening, and he was always gone by the time Marcus arrived for his midnight shift. The executive suite was usually dark except for the small security lights that stayed on all night. Tonight was different. Marcus had noticed the lights were still on when he stepped off the elevator, and he could hear the faint sound of classical music coming from behind the closed door. As he got closer, he realized it wasn't music at all, but the sound of someone crying. The discovery made him uncomfortable, but he couldn't just ignore it either. What if something was seriously wrong? He had heard rumors about Blackwell's health. The other cleaning staff whispered about how the man had been losing weight, how he sometimes looked pale and shaky when they saw him leaving the building in the evenings. Maria, who cleaned the executive bathroom, had mentioned finding prescription bottles in the wastebasket, though she couldn't read the labels well enough to know what they were for. Marcus had dismissed most of the gossip as typical office building chatter, but seeing Blackwell now, hunched over his desk in the middle of the night, made those rumors seem more serious. Marcus decided to finish cleaning the rest of the floor first, hoping that by the time he returned to the executive suite, Blackwell would have gone home. He worked his way through the accounting department, the conference rooms, and the legal offices with unusual efficiency, his mind wandering to his daughter Emma and the parent-teacher conference he had scheduled for the next day. Emma's grades had been slipping lately, and her teacher wanted to discuss whether she might benefit from counseling to help her cope with losing her mother 3 years ago. The grief counselor Emma had seen immediately after Sarah's death had helped initially, but lately, Emma had been asking harder questions about why her mother had to die and why other kids had 2 parents when she only had 1. Marcus tried his best to answer her questions honestly, without overwhelming her with the financial and emotional struggles he faced every day. He never wanted Emma to feel like a burden, even though raising her alone on a janitor's salary meant making sacrifices he never could have imagined when Sarah was alive. When Marcus returned to the executive floor an hour later, the lights were still on in Blackwell's office, and the man was still sitting at his desk. This time, however, he wasn't crying. He was holding what appeared to be a photograph, staring at it with an expression that Marcus could only describe as haunted. Every few seconds, Blackwell would reach for a glass of what looked like whiskey, take a small sip, and then set it back down without taking his eyes off the photograph. Marcus stood in the hallway for several minutes, debating what to do. His supervisor had made it clear that the cleaning staff should never disturb the executives unless there was an emergency, but something about the scene felt wrong. Blackwell looked sick, not just sad, but physically unwell. His skin had a greyish pallor that seemed worse under the harsh office lighting, and Marcus could see that his hands were trembling as he held the photograph. Finally, Marcus knocked gently on the glass door. Blackwell looked up, startled, and quickly slipped the photograph into his desk drawer. For a moment, the two men stared at each other through the glass, and Marcus was struck by how much older Blackwell looked than his 68 years. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, and there were lines of exhaustion etched around his mouth that seemed deeper than they had been just a few weeks ago. Blackwell gestured for Marcus to come in, and when Marcus opened the door, he was hit by the smell of expensive alcohol mixed with something else he couldn't identify. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, but it was heavy and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Peckett." "Blackwell," Marcus said, staying near the door. "I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. I noticed the lights were still on, and I thought maybe—" Blackwell waved him off with a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm fine, Marcus. Thank you for checking. I just couldn't sleep, so I thought I'd get some work done." Marcus nodded, but he didn't move toward the door. Something about Blackwell's voice seemed off. It was hoarse, as if he had been crying for hours, and there was a slight slur to his words that suggested the whiskey glass had been refilled multiple times. "Are you feeling all right, sir?" "You look a little pale." Blackwell laughed, but it sounded more like a cough. "Getting old, Marcus. That's all. Some nights are harder than others." Marcus wanted to leave it at that, but his instincts as a father kicked in. When Emma was trying to hide that she was upset about something, she had the same forced cheerfulness in her voice. The same way of deflecting concern with humor. He recognized the signs of someone who was struggling and trying not to show it. "Would you like me to call someone for you? A family member, or maybe your doctor?" "No," Blackwell said quickly, almost desperately. "No, please don't call anyone. I'm fine, really. I just need some time to think." Marcus nodded slowly, but as he turned to leave, he noticed something that made him pause. On the floor beside Blackwell's chair, partially hidden by the shadow of the desk, was an envelope. It had been torn open hastily, and several papers had spilled out onto the expensive carpet. Marcus could see what looked like medical test results, with official letterheads and charts that meant nothing to him but clearly meant a great deal to Blackwell. "Mr. Blackwell," Marcus said carefully, "I don't mean to pry, but if you're dealing with health issues, you shouldn't be handling them alone. I know what it's like to feel like you have to carry everything by yourself, but sometimes accepting help is the strongest thing you can do." For a moment, Blackwell's carefully maintained composure cracked, and Marcus saw something raw and desperate in his eyes. It was the look of a man who was carrying a burden too heavy for one person to bear, the look of someone who was drowning but too proud to ask for a life preserver. "You have a daughter, don't you, Marcus?" Blackwell asked suddenly. "Yes, sir, Emma. She's 10. And if something happened to you, something that was your fault, would you want her to know about it?" The question caught Marcus off guard. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean." Blackwell reached for his whiskey glass again, but his hand was shaking so badly that he knocked it over instead. The amber liquid spread across his desk, soaking into papers and dripping onto the floor. He stared at the mess for a long moment, then looked up at Marcus with tears in his eyes. "I think I'm dying, Marcus. And I think I deserve it." Marcus stepped forward instinctively, grabbing some tissues from the box on Blackwell's desk to clean up the spilled whiskey. As he soaked up the liquid, he could see that some of the papers on the desk were personal letters, written in a shaky handwriting that looked like it belonged to a child. The words he could make out were heartbreaking. "Why won't you come see me?" And, "I miss you so much, Daddy." "Mr. Blackwell," Marcus said gently, "whatever is going on, you don't have to face it alone. And you certainly don't deserve to die. Everyone makes mistakes, but that doesn't mean they can't be fixed." Blackwell shook his head violently. "You don't understand. This isn't a mistake that can be fixed. This is something I did 30 years ago that destroyed lives, and now it's destroying mine." Marcus finished cleaning up the whiskey and sat down in the chair across from Blackwell's desk. "I found it." He knew he was overstepping boundaries, but something about the man's desperation reminded him of his own darkest moments after Sarah's death, when he had felt like giving up because the weight of single parenthood seemed impossible to bear. "Want to tell me about it?" Marcus asked simply. Blackwell stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether this night shift janitor could possibly understand the complexities of his situation. Finally, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the photograph he had been looking at when Marcus first saw him. It was a picture of a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, with dark curls and a gap-toothed smile. She was wearing a yellow sundress and holding what appeared to be a handmade Father's Day card. On the back of the photograph, in a child's careful printing, were the words, "For the best daddy in the world." Her name was Christina, Blackwell said quietly. And she was my daughter. Marcus held the photograph carefully, studying the little girl's face. There was something familiar about her features, something that reminded him of Blackwell despite the decades that separated this moment from when the picture was taken. The child's eyes held the same intensity, the same intelligent spark that Marcus had occasionally seen in Blackwell during their brief encounters in the hallways of the building. "She's beautiful," Marcus said, handing the photograph back. "What happened to her?" Blackwell's hands trembled as he took the picture, holding it as if it might disappear if he didn't grip it tightly enough. "I abandoned her when she was 7 years old, just walked away and never looked back." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with decades of regret. Marcus waited, sensing that there was more to the story, that this confession was just the beginning of whatever had been eating away at Richard Blackwell for 30 years. Her mother Linda was 19 when we met. I was 26, fresh out of business school, and convinced I was going to conquer the world. Linda was working as a waitress at a diner near my first apartment, putting herself through nursing school one class at a time. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen, but more than that, she was kind. Really genuinely kind, in a way that I didn't understand then because I had never experienced it. Blackwell paused to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand. The whiskey had loosened his tongue, but Marcus could see that even in his altered state, every word was painful to speak. We dated for 2 years before she got pregnant. I was starting to make real money by then, working for a development company, learning the business. When Linda told me about the baby, I was terrified. But I thought I was ready to be a father. I thought love would be enough to make up for everything I didn't know about raising a child. Marcus nodded, remembering his own fear when Sarah had told him she was pregnant with Emma. The difference was, he had been 28 and already married, with a stable job and a savings account. He couldn't imagine facing parenthood at 26 with a girlfriend he had only known for 2 years. Christina was born on a Tuesday in March, Blackwell continued, his voice growing softer. She weighed 6 pounds, 3 ounces, and she had this tiny, perfect nose and these huge dark eyes that seemed to see everything. I fell in love with her the moment the nurse put her in my arms. I had never felt anything like it before, that immediate, overwhelming need to protect someone. Blackwell reached into his desk drawer again and pulled out a small stack of papers. Marcus could see they were more letters, all in the same childish handwriting, all addressed to Daddy. Some of the envelopes were yellow with age, others looked newer, as if they had been written recently. For the first 7 years, I thought I was doing everything right. I worked long hours to provide for them, but I made sure to be home for dinner most nights. I taught Christina how to ride a bike, helped her with her homework, read her stories before bed. Linda and I never got married, but we were happy. We were a family. Marcus could hear the pain in Blackwell's voice, the way it cracked on certain words as if speaking them physically hurt. He had seen the same expression on Emma's face when she talked about her mother, that mixture of love and loss that never fully healed. "What changed?" Marcus asked gently. Blackwell laughed bitterly. "Money, success, the opportunity to build something bigger than I had ever imagined." He gestured around the luxurious office with its expensive furniture and panoramic view of the city. A partner in the development company offered me a chance to go in on a major project. Shopping centers, office buildings, residential developments across 3 states. It would mean traveling constantly for at least 5 years, but the potential profits were enormous. Marcus began to understand where the story was heading, and his heart sank for both the man sitting across from him and the little girl in the photograph. Linda begged me not to take it. She said we had enough money, that Christina needed her father more than we needed another zero in the bank account. But I couldn't see past the opportunity. I convinced myself that I was doing it for them, that I was securing their future. I told Linda it would only be temporary, that once the projects were established, I could step back and be more present. Blackwell set the photograph down on his desk and stared at it as he continued speaking. The first year was the hardest. I was gone 4 or 5 days a week, sometimes more. When I was home, I was exhausted and distracted, always taking phone calls or reviewing contracts. Christina started asking why I was never around for her school plays or soccer games. Linda started looking tired all the time, and I knew she was struggling to raise Christina essentially as a single mother. Marcus thought about his own experience as a single parent, how exhausting it could be to handle all the responsibilities of childcare without a partner, but at least he had never had a choice in the matter. Blackwell had chosen to leave his family, even if he hadn't intended it to be permanent. By the second year, I was making more money than I had ever imagined possible, but I was hardly ever home. When I was there, Christina seemed almost shy around me, as if I had become a stranger. She would show me her drawings or tell me about school, but there was a distance that hadn't been there before. Linda tried to talk to me about it, but I was so focused on the business that I dismissed her concerns. Blackwell picked up one of the letters from his desk and opened it carefully. The paper was creased and worn, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times over the years. "This is the letter that changed everything," he said, handing it to Marcus. Christina wrote it for Father's Day when she was 7. Linda had helped her mail it to my hotel in Denver because I missed the actual holiday. Marcus read the letter silently, his heart breaking with every word. "Dear Daddy, I made you a card at school, but Mommy said you were too far away to give it to you. She said you are working very hard to take care of us, but I wish you would come home more. I miss you every day, and I dream about you at night. Mrs. Peterson at school said that some daddies have to work far away, but they still love their little girls very much. Do you still love me very much? I try to be good, so maybe you will want to come home. I love you bigger than the sky. Your daughter, Christina." Marcus had to stop reading twice because the words became blurry through his tears. He looked up to find Blackwell watching him with an expression of desperate pain. When I read that letter in my hotel room, I realized what I was doing to her. She was 7 years old and questioning whether her father loved her because I was never around. I called Linda immediately and told her I was coming home, that I was going to turn down the next phase of the project and focus on being a father. Marcus handed the letter back, afraid to ask what had happened next because he suspected he already knew. But when I got home, there was a message waiting for me from my business partner. The biggest opportunity yet. A chance to develop an entire downtown district in a major city. The kind of project that comes along once in a lifetime. The meeting was scheduled for the next morning, and if I missed it, I would be out of the partnership entirely. Blackwell closed his eyes, as if the memory was too painful to face while looking at Christina's photograph. I told myself it would be the last time. One more trip, one more deal, and then I would have enough money to retire early and spend all my time with Christina. Linda was getting ready to take her to school when I made the call to arrange my flight. Christina was eating breakfast at the kitchen table, still in her pajamas, and she looked up at me with those big dark eyes and asked if I was leaving again. Marcus could picture the scene clearly, could imagine the little girl's disappointment and confusion as her father prepared to break another promise. I lied to her face. I told her I would be back in a few days, that this was the last trip, that everything would be different when I got home. She hugged me goodbye and made me promise to bring her a present. I promised her I would, and I meant it. I really believed I was coming back. Blackwell opened his eyes and looked directly at Marcus, but I never did come back. The project was even bigger than I had imagined, and it led to another project, and another. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Every time I called home, Linda sounded more distant, more exhausted. Christina stopped asking when I was coming home. Marcus felt a surge of anger toward the man sitting across from him, but it was tempered by pity for the little girl who had waited for a father who never returned. "Why didn't you go back?" "Because I was a coward," Blackwell said simply. "The longer I stayed away, the harder it became to imagine going home and facing what I had done." Linda stopped returning my calls. The letters from Christina became less frequent, and then they stopped altogether. I told myself they were better off without me, that Linda would find someone who could be the father Christina deserved. Blackwell reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a more recent envelope, postmarked just 3 weeks ago. Marcus could see that the handwriting was different now, more mature, but still recognizably the same person who had written the Father's Day letter decades earlier. "She's been writing to me for 30 years, Blackwell said quietly. At first, the letters came to my old business address, then somehow she tracked down my new addresses as I moved and expanded the company. For 30 years, she's been writing to tell me about her life, her achievements, her struggles, her hopes. She got married 5 years ago, had a baby 2 years ago. She named the baby Richard, after me. Marcus stared at the envelope in Blackwell's hands, trying to process the incredible persistence and love it must have taken for Christina to keep writing to her father who had never responded, never acknowledged her existence. "Have you ever written back?" "Never," Blackwell admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I convinced myself that responding would only cause more pain, that she was better off thinking of me as someone who had died rather than someone who had chosen to abandon her. But the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid she would reject me, afraid she would hate me, afraid I would disappoint her again." Blackwell opened the most recent letter with shaking hands. "She's sick, Marcus. She has cancer, and she's asking to see me before she dies. She says she forgives me for leaving, that she understands I must have had my reasons, and that she just wants to meet her father one time so her son can know where he came from." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a man who had spent 30 years running from his responsibilities as a father, and now his daughter was dying and still reaching out to him with forgiveness and love. The cruel irony was that Blackwell had gained everything he thought he wanted, wealth and success and recognition, but he was about to lose the one thing that really mattered. "When did you get this letter?" 3 days ago, the same day I got the results from my cardiologist." Blackwell gestured toward the medical papers scattered on his desk. "Severe heart disease brought on by decades of stress and guilt. He gives me 6 months, maybe a year if I make drastic lifestyle changes." Marcus looked at the man across from him with new understanding. Blackwell wasn't just dealing with physical illness. He was facing the possibility of dying without ever seeing his daughter again, of taking his cowardice and regret to the grave. "You have to go to her," Marcus said firmly. "Whatever you're afraid of, whatever you think might happen, you have to try." Blackwell shook his head. "It's too late. Too much time has passed. She probably only wrote that letter out of some misguided sense of duty, or maybe she wants closure before she dies. But she doesn't really want to see me. How could she?" Marcus thought about Emma, about how much she missed her mother, even 3 years after Sarah's death. He thought about all the questions she asked, about her family history, her need to understand where she came from, and why her life had turned out the way it had. "You don't get to decide what she wants," Marcus said quietly. "She's been writing to you for 30 years. She named her son after you. She's dying, and she's asking to see you. Don't you think she deserved the chance to make that choice for herself?" Blackwell stared at the letter in his hands, tears streaming down his face. For the first time since Marcus had known him, the wealthy businessman looked completely vulnerable, stripped of all the armor that money and success had provided. "I don't know how to be a father to her now," Blackwell whispered. "I don't know how to face her after what I've done." Marcus stood up and walked around the desk, placing a gentle hand on Blackwell's shoulder. "You start by showing up." The next morning, Marcus found himself in a position he never could have imagined. He was sitting in the passenger seat of Richard Blackwell's Mercedes, driving toward the airport to catch a flight to Portland, Oregon, where Christina lived with her husband and 2-year-old son. Blackwell had asked Marcus to come with him, and despite every rational voice in his head telling him this was a terrible idea, Marcus had said yes. The decision had been made in the early hours of the morning, after Marcus had spent 3 hours in Blackwell's office, listening to him read through 30 years' worth of letters from a daughter who had never stopped hoping for a relationship with her father. By the time the sun began to rise over the city, both men were emotionally exhausted. But something had shifted between them. The barriers of class and wealth that usually separated their worlds had dissolved in the face of shared understanding about what it meant to be a parent. Marcus had called his supervisor and requested emergency personal time, something he had never done in 8 months of working for the cleaning company. He had also called Mrs. Rodriguez to ask if she could watch Emma for a few extra days, explaining only that a friend needed his help with a family emergency. Emma had been confused by the sudden change in plans, but she trusted her father's judgment enough not to argue when he explained that he might be gone longer than usual. "I still can't believe you're doing this," Blackwell said for the 3rd time since they had left the parking garage beneath his building. "You don't even know me, and you're taking time off work to help me reconnect with a daughter who probably hates me." Marcus adjusted his seatbelt and looked out the window at the busy morning traffic. "Emma asks me about her grandparents sometimes," he said. "Sarah's parents died before Emma was born, and my parents live in California. She feels like she's missing pieces of her family history, like there are empty spaces where other people should be. I can't imagine what it would be like for her to know that her family was out there, but choosing not to be part of her life." Blackwell was quiet for several minutes, navigating through the lanes of cars heading toward the airport. Marcus could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel, as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored to reality. "What if she takes one look at me and realizes she made a mistake?" Blackwell asked suddenly. What if seeing me in person makes her angry? Or what if I say the wrong thing and make everything worse? Marcus had been wondering the same things himself, but he had come to a conclusion during the sleepless hours after leaving Blackwell's office. Then, at least you'll know you tried. At least she'll know that you cared enough to show up, even if it was 30 years too late. The flight to Portland was Blackwell's first time in an airplane in over 2 years. He had become increasingly anxious about travel as his heart condition worsened, and Marcus could see him struggling with claustrophobia and panic during takeoff. It occurred to Marcus that for all his wealth and worldly experience, Blackwell was fundamentally as scared and uncertain as any parent facing a difficult conversation with their child. During the 3-hour flight, Marcus learned more about Blackwell's life than he had picked up in 8 months of cleaning his office. The man who seemed so confident and successful from a distance was actually deeply lonely, with few real friends and no romantic relationships that had lasted longer than a few months. He had built an empire, but he had no one to share it with and no one to leave it to except distant relatives he barely knew. I used to tell myself that the money would make up for lost time, Blackwell said as their plane began its descent into Portland. I thought if I could just accumulate enough wealth, I could somehow buy my way back into Christina's life. I set up trust funds for her, college accounts, investment portfolios. I hired private investigators to keep track of her major life events so I could send anonymous gifts for her birthday and Christmas. Marcus was surprised by this revelation. She knew the gifts were from you? I don't think so. The investigators were very discreet, and I made sure everything looked like it came from legitimate sources. Scholarships, contest winnings, surprise bonuses from her job. I wanted to help her without her knowing it was me, because I was afraid that if she knew, she might refuse the help out of pride or anger. It struck Marcus as both generous and cowardly, a way for Blackwell to ease his guilt without taking any real emotional risk. Did it help? Knowing that you were providing for her in some way? Blackwell shook his head. It made me feel worse, actually. Every time I arranged for money to be given to her, I was reminded of all the things I couldn't give her through anonymous gifts. I couldn't be there when she graduated from high school or college. I couldn't walk her down the aisle at her wedding. I couldn't hold my grandson when he was born.
Money can't buy back lost time, and it can't replace the presence of a parent.
As their plane touched down in Portland, Marcus felt a sudden surge of anxiety about what they were walking into.
He had convinced Blackwell to make this trip, but he had no idea what they would find when they got to Christina's house. What if she was too sick to see visitors? What if her husband was hostile toward Blackwell? What if the reunion went so badly that it caused more harm than good? But it was too late for second thoughts now. They had rented a car at the airport and programmed the address from Christina's latest letter into the GPS system. As they drove through the suburbs of Portland toward the modest neighborhood where she lived, Marcus could see Blackwell's nervousness increasing with every mile. Tell me about Emma, Blackwell said suddenly, clearly trying to distract himself from his own anxiety. What kind of father are you? The question caught Marcus off guard. He had been so focused on Blackwell's situation that he hadn't thought much about his own parenting in comparison. I try to be present, he said after a moment. I try to make sure she knows she's the most important thing in my life, even when work or money problems make that difficult to show. Do you think you're a good father? Marcus considered the question seriously. I think I'm a better father than I thought I could be when Sarah died. I make mistakes, but I learn from them. I listen when Emma talks to me, even when she's talking about things that seem unimportant. I show up for her school events and soccer games, even when I'm tired or stressed. I guess I try to be the kind of father I would have wanted when I was her age. Blackwell nodded slowly. I never learned how to do that. My own father was distant and critical, focused entirely on work and success. I swore I would be different with Christina, but when the pressure of providing for a family became real, I fell back on the only model I knew. I thought being a good father meant making money to support your family, not necessarily being physically or emotionally present. They were getting close to Christina's address now, and Marcus could see Blackwell's hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. The neighborhood was middle-class and well-maintained, with small houses and neat front yards. It was the kind of place where families stayed for decades, where children played in the streets and neighbors knew each other's names. This is it, Blackwell said, pulling up in front of a blue house with white trim and a small garden filled with winter flowers. There was a swing set in the backyard, and children's toys scattered across the front porch. It looked like a happy home, the kind of place where a child would feel safe and loved. They sat in the car for several minutes, neither man willing to take the first step toward the front door. Marcus could see curtains moving in one of the front windows, and he realized that whoever was inside had probably noticed their arrival. "What do I say to her?" Blackwell asked quietly. "How do I explain 30 years of absence in a way that doesn't sound like excuses?" Marcus thought about all the difficult conversations he had had with Emma about her mother's death, about why some families were different from others, about how love could exist even when people were separated by circumstances beyond their control. "You tell her the truth," Marcus said simply. "You tell her you made mistakes, that you were afraid and that you're sorry. You tell her you love her and you've thought about her every day for 30 years. And then you listen to whatever she needs to say to you." Blackwell took a deep breath and opened his car door. As they walked up the front path, Marcus noticed that his companion was walking more slowly than usual, whether from nerves or from the heart condition that was slowly killing him. Before they could reach the front door, it opened, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and the same intelligent eyes that Marcus had seen in the childhood photograph. She was thinner than she should have been, clearly showing the effects of her illness, but she was beautiful in a way that spoke of inner strength and resilience. Christina stood on her porch for a long moment, staring at the father she hadn't seen in 30 years. Marcus watched as a dozen different emotions crossed her face: recognition, disbelief, anger, hope, and finally, something that looked like relief. "Hello, Daddy," she said simply. Blackwell broke down completely, sobbing like a child as he looked at the daughter he had abandoned decades ago. Christina stepped forward without hesitation and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he wept against her shoulder. "I'm so sorry," Blackwell whispered through his tears. "I'm so sorry, Christina. I should have come back. I should have been here." "I know," Christina said quietly, her own voice thick with emotion. "I know you should have. But you're here now." Marcus stood at the edge of the porch, feeling like an intruder on this private moment, but unable to look away from the reunion he had helped make possible. After 30 years of separation, a father and daughter were finally in the same place at the same time, and despite all the pain and lost time between them, love had somehow survived. Inside Christina's house, the walls were covered with photographs that told the story of a life lived without her father. Marcus could see pictures of graduation ceremonies, wedding photos, baby pictures of a little boy with dark curls who looked remarkably like his grandfather. What struck him most was that in every family photo, there was an empty space, as if Christina had always left room for someone who might someday return. Christina's husband David was a quiet man with kind eyes who worked as a high school teacher. He shook Blackwell's hand with reserved politeness, but Marcus could see the protective tension in his shoulders. This was a man who had watched his wife struggle with questions about her father for their entire relationship, who had held her when she cried about feeling abandoned, and who was now face to face with the person responsible for that pain. "Richard is at his grandmother's house," Christina said, referring to her 2-year-old son. "I thought it might be better if we talked first, just the adults. He's too young to understand why his grandfather suddenly appeared after never being part of his life." The comment stung, and Marcus could see Blackwell wince at the implication. But Christina's tone wasn't cruel. It was matter-of-fact, the voice of a woman who had learned to protect her family from disappointment. They sat in the living room, an uncomfortable silence settling over the group as everyone tried to figure out how to navigate this unprecedented situation. Marcus felt out of place among this family reunion, but Christina had insisted he stay when Blackwell explained that Marcus was the one who had convinced him to make the trip. "I want to understand," Christina said finally, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly. "I need to know why you left and why you stayed away for so long." Blackwell looked older than his 68 years as he sat in Christina's modest living room, surrounded by evidence of the life he had missed. He began to speak, slowly at first, then with increasing honesty as he told his daughter about the business opportunity that had taken him away, about his fears and ambitions, and about how distance had made it easier to avoid the guilt of his choices. "I told myself you were better off without me," Blackwell said, his voice barely audible. "Your mother was so strong, so capable. I convinced myself that my presence would only complicate your life, that you would be happier if you could just forget about me entirely." Christina listened without interrupting, her face a careful mask that revealed nothing about her internal reaction. David sat beside her, occasionally reaching over to squeeze her hand when the emotion in the room became too intense. "But I never forgot about you," Christina said when Blackwell finished speaking. "I thought about you every single day. I wondered if you were alive or dead, if you ever thought about me, if I had done something wrong that made you leave." The pain in her voice was raw and immediate, despite the decades that had passed since her childhood. Marcus found himself thinking about Emma, about how even small disappointments could linger in a child's mind for years. He couldn't imagine the impact of a parent simply disappearing without explanation. "You didn't do anything wrong," Blackwell said urgently. "You were perfect, Christina. You were the best thing I ever did with my life, and leaving you was the worst mistake I ever made. Then why didn't you come back?" The question came out as almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of 30 years of wondering. Blackwell was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands folded in his lap. When he finally looked up, his eyes were filled with a shame so deep it was painful to witness. "Because I was a coward," he said simply. "Because the longer I stayed away, the harder it became to imagine facing you. Because I knew I had hurt you, and I was afraid that seeing me would only hurt you more." Christina stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to the room. Marcus could see her shoulders shaking, and he realized she was crying silently. David started to get up to comfort her, but she held up a hand to stop him. "Do you know what the hardest part was?" she asked, still facing the window. "It wasn't missing you at Father's Day or graduation. It wasn't wondering if you loved me. The hardest part was other people asking about you and not having any answer to give them." She turned around, and Marcus could see tears streaming down her face. "When I was 8, my friend Jenny asked why I didn't have a daddy like everyone else. I told her you had died in a car accident, because that seemed easier than explaining that you had just left. For 30 years, I've been telling people you were dead because it was less humiliating than admitting you had chosen not to be part of my life." The words hit Blackwell like physical blows, and Marcus watched him shrink into himself as he realized the full extent of the damage his absence had caused. "I received every letter you wrote," Blackwell said quietly. "I kept them all. I know about your high school graduation, your nursing degree, your wedding, Richard's birth. I've been following your life from a distance, and I've been so proud of everything you've accomplished." "Then why didn't you ever write back?" Christina's voice was rising now, years of suppressed anger finally finding an outlet. "Why didn't you call or visit or give me any sign that you knew I existed?"
Because I thought it was too late.
"Because I thought you would be angry." "I was angry," Christina shouted. "I've been angry for 30 years, but I still wanted my father." The room fell silent except for the sound of Christina's crying. David got up and put his arms around her, glaring at Blackwell over her head with undisguised hostility. "I think you should go," David said firmly. "Christina is sick, and this is too much stress for her right now." But Christina pulled away from her husband's embrace and looked directly at her father. "No," she said. "I've waited 30 years for this conversation. I'm not stopping now." She sat back down, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. When she spoke again, her voice was calmer but no less determined. "I have cancer, Daddy. Ovarian cancer, stage 3. The doctors give me maybe 6 months, a year if the experimental treatments work. I wrote to you because I'm dying, and I wanted to see you before that happened." Blackwell's face went white, and Marcus could see him struggling to process this information. "The treatments," he said desperately. "Are you getting the best care? Is there anything I can do, any specialist you need to see?" "Money can't fix this," Christina said gently. "Trust me, we've explored every option. David has good insurance through the school district, and we've seen specialists at Oregon Health Sciences University. This isn't something you can solve by throwing money at it." "But there must be something," Blackwell insisted. "Experimental trials, treatments in other countries, anything." Marcus could see the desperation in Blackwell's eyes, the same frantic energy he had seen in parents at Emma's school when their children were facing serious problems. It was the look of someone who had spent their whole life believing that any problem could be solved with enough effort and resources, suddenly confronted with something beyond their control. "What I need from you can't be bought," Christina said firmly. "I need to know that you love me even when you weren't here. I need to understand why you left so that I can make peace with it before I die. And I need you to be a grandfather to Richard, even if it's only for a short time." The mention of her son seemed to break something in Blackwell. He began crying again, but this time it was different. These weren't tears of shame or self-pity. They were tears of grief, for all the time that had been lost, for all the moments he would never be able to reclaim. "I loved you every single day," he said through his tears. "I loved you when I left, and I loved you when I stayed away. I dreamed about you, worried about you, celebrated your achievements from a distance. I was never not thinking about you." Christina nodded slowly, as if this confirmation was something she had needed to hear but hadn't dared to hope for. I named Richard after you, she said softly. David wanted to name him after his father, but I insisted on Richard. I told David it was a family name, that it would connect our son to his heritage. You named him after me even though I had never been part of your life? Because you were still my father, Christina said simply. Because love doesn't stop just because someone goes away. Marcus felt his own eyes filling with tears as he watched this conversation unfold. He thought about his own relationship with Emma, how much effort he put into being present for every moment of her life because he knew how quickly children grew up and how important it was not to miss the milestones that could never be repeated. I want to meet him, Blackwell said. I want to be part of his life, however long you'll let me. Christina looked at David, who had been silent during most of this exchange. Marcus could see the couple having a wordless conversation, weighing the risks of letting Blackwell into their son's life against the possibility that this might be their only chance for Richard to know his grandfather. We'll start slow, David said finally. Richard is too young to understand the complicated history here. As far as he's concerned, you're just Grandpa Richard who came to visit. If you want to be part of his life, you have to commit to it. You can't disappear again when things get difficult. I won't disappear, Blackwell said urgently. I swear to you, I won't make the same mistakes again. David's expression remained skeptical. This isn't just about you and Christina anymore. Richard is my priority, and if I think your presence is causing him confusion or pain, I'll ask you to leave. Marcus admired David's protectiveness, even as he understood Blackwell's desperate desire to be given a chance. It was the same instinct he had with Emma, that willingness to be the bad guy if it meant protecting his child from potential harm. I understand, Blackwell said. I respect your rules, and I'm grateful for any opportunity to know my grandson. Christina looked exhausted from the emotional intensity of the conversation, but there was also something like peace in her expression. Richard should be home soon, she said. Why don't we have some coffee and you can tell me about your life? I want to know who my father became after he left us. As they moved into the kitchen, Marcus noticed that some of the tension in the room had dissipated. The worst of the anger had been expressed. The most important truths had been spoken. And now they were beginning the delicate process of figuring out how to build a relationship from the ashes of 30 years of separation. Blackwell told Christina about his business empire, but he also talked about his loneliness, his regrets, and his gradual realization that success without family was hollow and meaningless. Christina talked about her career as a nurse, her marriage to David, and the joy that Richard had brought into their lives despite the shadow of her illness. When they heard a car door slam in the driveway, Christina smiled for the first time since they had arrived. That's my mother-in-law bringing Richard home from his playdate. Are you ready to meet your grandson? Blackwell's hands were shaking again, but this time it seemed to be from excitement rather than fear. I've been ready for 2 years, ever since I found out he existed. Marcus watched from the kitchen doorway as a toddler with dark curls burst through the front door, chattering excitedly about his morning at his friend's house. When Richard saw the strangers in his kitchen, he became shy, hiding behind his grandmother's legs and peeking out at Blackwell with curious eyes. Richard, Christina said gently, kneeling down to her son's level. This is your Grandpa Richard. He came all the way from far away to meet you. The little boy studied Blackwell with the serious expression that children sometimes wear when they're trying to figure out if a new adult is friend or foe. After a long moment, he stepped forward and held up a small toy truck. This is my truck, Richard said solemnly. It's red. Blackwell knelt down carefully, his heart condition making the movement difficult. It's a very nice truck, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I used to have a truck like that when I was little. Did your daddy give it to you? Richard asked innocently. The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that the little boy couldn't possibly understand. Blackwell looked up at Christina, then back at his grandson. No, he said honestly. My daddy wasn't very good at giving presents. But I'm here now, and I'd very much like to play trucks with you, if that's okay. Richard considered this proposal seriously, then nodded and handed his grandfather the toy truck. You can be the driver, he said generously. Marcus watched as Blackwell took the toy with trembling hands, his face filled with wonder as his grandson settled beside him on the kitchen floor to begin an elaborate game involving truck races and imaginary construction sites. For the first time since Marcus had known him, Richard Blackwell looked genuinely happy. 6 months later, Marcus stood in the same hospital corridor where he had once brought Emma for a broken arm. But this time, he was visiting someone who had become an unexpected friend. The oncology ward was quieter than the emergency room, filled with a different kind of tension as families navigated the uncertain territory between hope and grief. Christina's condition had deteriorated more quickly than anyone had anticipated. The experimental treatments that had initially shown promise had stopped working in March, and by May she had made the difficult decision to stop aggressive intervention and focus on comfort care. She wanted to spend her remaining time at home with her family, but a recent infection had required hospitalization. Blackwell had moved to Portland permanently in February, selling his business empire and buying a small house just 3 blocks away from Christina and David's home. The transition hadn't been smooth. Decades of independence and wealth had not prepared him for the day-to-day realities of being part of a family, and there had been tense moments when his instinct to solve problems with money clashed with David's more practical approach to parenting. But Richard had been the bridge that allowed the adults to find their way past their complicated history. The little boy had accepted his grandfather's presence with the adaptability that children possess, and watching Blackwell read bedtime stories or build block towers with his grandson had slowly convinced David that the older man's commitment to being present was genuine. Marcus had returned to his life in the city, but he had stayed in touch with both men through regular phone calls and occasional visits. The experience of helping to reunite a father and daughter had changed something in him as well. He had started taking Emma on weekend trips to visit his own parents in California, determined not to let distance and busy schedules create the same kind of separation that had haunted Blackwell for 30 years. When Marcus entered Christina's hospital room, he found a scene that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Blackwell was sitting beside his daughter's bed, holding her hand while she slept. David was in the chair by the window, grading papers while keeping a watchful eye on his wife's vital signs. And Richard was curled up on a small cot that the nurses had brought in, taking an afternoon nap surrounded by the quiet sounds of medical equipment. "How is she today?" Marcus asked quietly, not wanting to wake Christina. "Tired," Blackwell said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. "But she had a good morning. She was able to eat some breakfast, and she spent about an hour playing with Richard before she needed to rest." Marcus could see that Blackwell had lost weight since moving to Portland. The stress of watching his daughter die, combined with his own heart condition, was taking a visible toll. But there was something different about him too, something more peaceful than Marcus had seen in their first encounter in the office building.
Marcus?
Christina's voice was weak, but she was smiling as she opened her eyes.
I'm so glad you came. Marcus pulled up a chair on the other side of her bed.
"How are you feeling?" "Like I'm dying," Christina said with a frankness that might have been shocking to someone who didn't know her. "But also, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She gestured around the room, taking in her sleeping son, her husband, and her father. 6 months ago, Richard was just a name to me. Now he's here every day, reading to our son, helping David with household projects, arguing with me about my care plan, like any overprotective parent would. Blackwell squeezed her hand gently. "I'm making up for 30 years of not being overprotective." "You're making up for a lot of things," Christina agreed. "But you're also creating new memories, not just trying to fix old problems." Marcus had watched this transformation happen gradually over the past 6 months. Initially, Blackwell had approached his relationship with Christina and Richard like a business problem to be solved. He had tried to hire the best doctors, buy the most expensive treatments, and generally overwhelm his family with resources that he thought would demonstrate his love and commitment. It had taken several difficult conversations, including one where David had threatened to limit Blackwell's access to Richard before the older man began to understand that what his family needed wasn't his money, but his presence. They needed him to show up for ordinary moments, not just emergencies. They needed him to be patient with Richard's toddler tantrums, to listen when Christina wanted to talk about her fears, and to accept that love couldn't be expressed through grand gestures alone. "Tell Marcus about the swing set," Christina said, smiling at her father. Blackwell looked embarrassed. "I may have gone a little overboard with Richard's birthday present." "A little overboard?" David laughed from his chair by the window. "He hired a crew to build a playground in our backyard that's bigger than most city parks. Richard likes swings," Blackwell said defensively. "And slides. And climbing structures. And now every kid in the neighborhood comes to our house to play," Christina added. "Which Richard loves. But David wasn't prepared to become the unofficial daycare center for the entire block." Marcus could picture the scene clearly. Blackwell, trying to express 3 decades of missed birthdays through one elaborate gift, not understanding that his grandson would have been just as happy with a simple swing and some quality time with his grandfather. "The kids love it though," David admitted. "And watching Dad try to keep up with 8 toddlers on that playground has been pretty entertaining." The easy way David referred to Blackwell as Dad wasn't lost on Marcus. It had taken months for David to get past his protective anger toward the man who had abandoned his wife, but gradually he had come to see that Blackwell's presence was healing something in Christina that David hadn't been able to fix on his own. "Marcus helped us understand something important," Christina said, looking at her father. "Remember what you told us about showing up?" Marcus thought back to that conversation in the hospital room where Blackwell had been struggling with feelings of inadequacy about his role in his daughter's life. Christina had been having a particularly difficult day with her treatment, and Blackwell had been frustrated by his inability to make her feel better. "I told him that sometimes showing up is enough," Marcus said, "that you don't have to solve every problem or fix every pain. Sometimes just being present is the most important gift you can give someone." "It was a hard lesson for me to learn," Blackwell admitted. "I spent my whole career believing that every problem had a solution if you just worked hard enough and threw enough resources at it. Cancer doesn't care how much money you have." Christina shifted in her bed, wincing slightly as she tried to find a more comfortable position. The pain medication helped, but Marcus could see that she was struggling more than she had been even a few weeks ago. "I want to tell you something," Christina said to Marcus. "Something I realized after Dad came back into my life." Marcus leaned closer, sensing that whatever Christina wanted to say was important to her. "I spent 30 years being angry about what I didn't have," she said. "I focused so much on the father who wasn't there that I almost missed appreciating the life I did have. My mother did an amazing job raising me on her own. David has been an incredible husband and father. I have a career I love and friends who care about me." She paused to catch her breath, the effort of speaking for so long clearly taxing her limited energy. "When Dad came back, I thought what I wanted was answers about why he left. But what I actually needed was permission to stop being angry. I needed to understand that his choices weren't a reflection of my worth as a person." Marcus thought about his own journey as a single parent, how he sometimes worried that Emma's life was somehow less complete because she didn't have a mother. It was a fear that crept in during quiet moments, the concern that no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't give her everything she needed. "Emma is lucky to have you," Christina said, as if reading his thoughts. "You've been present for every day of her life. You've never had to wonder if your father loved you, because she can see it in everything you do." Richard stirred on his cot, waking up from his nap with the groggy confusion that toddlers display when they're not sure where they are. He looked around the hospital room, his eyes settling on his grandfather with the automatic trust that had developed between them over the past 6 months. "Grandpa Richard," the little boy said, holding up his arms to be lifted, "I had a dream about trucks." Blackwell carefully picked up his grandson, mindful of the medical equipment surrounding Christina's bed. "What kind of trucks were in your dream?" "Big ones," Richard said seriously, "with ladders like fire trucks. And they could fly." "Flying fire trucks?" Blackwell repeated thoughtfully. "That sounds very useful. Where did they fly to?" "To help people," Richard said matter-of-factly. "Like Mama helps people at the hospital." Christina's eyes filled with tears as she listened to her son's innocent assessment of her work as a nurse. Even at 2 years old, he understood that his mother's job was about helping others, though he couldn't comprehend the irony that now she was the one who needed help. "That's right," Christina said softly. "That's what we do. We help people." Marcus realized that this was exactly what had happened 6 months ago in Blackwell's office. He had helped a man who was drowning in guilt and regret find his way back to the family he thought he had lost forever. Blackwell had helped his daughter find peace with their complicated past. Christina had helped her father understand that love and presence were more valuable than wealth and success. And little Richard, in his innocent way, had helped all the adults in his life remember what really mattered. "I need to ask you something," Blackwell said to Marcus as they stood in the hospital hallway later that evening. Christina was resting, and David had taken Richard home for dinner and bedtime. "What is it?" "I want you to be Richard's godfather," Blackwell said. "Christina and David have agreed, but only if you're willing." Marcus was stunned by the request. "I don't understand. You barely know me, and Richard has family." "You're the reason I'm here," Blackwell said simply. "You're the reason I got to know my daughter before she died, and you're the reason Richard will grow up knowing his grandfather. If something happens to David and me, I want Richard to be raised by someone who understands what it means to put family first." Marcus thought about Emma, about how much his life had been enriched by having her in it. The idea of helping to raise another child, especially one who had already lost so much, felt both daunting and deeply meaningful. "What would that mean exactly?" Marcus asked. "It would mean being part of his life as he grows up," Blackwell said. "Being someone he can call when he has questions about his mother or his grandfather. Being present for the important moments, the way you've been present for Emma. Marcus looked through the window of Christina's room, where she was sleeping peacefully surrounded by photos of her son and letters from her father. This woman, who was facing death at 37, had managed to forgive a parent who had abandoned her and create space for love in a situation that could have been defined by bitterness and resentment. "Yes," Marcus said. "I'd be honored." 2 weeks later, Christina died peacefully at home with her family around her. The funeral was small but deeply meaningful, attended by friends from her work, neighbors who had watched Richard grow up, and colleagues of David's from the school where he taught. Blackwell spoke about his daughter with a mixture of pride and regret, but also with gratitude for the chance to know her as an adult and to be forgiven for his failures as a father. Marcus spoke too about courage and forgiveness, about the importance of showing up even when it felt too late to make a difference. He talked about how Christina had taught everyone who knew her that love was stronger than anger, and that family was defined not by biology alone but by the willingness to be present for each other through both joy and sorrow. After the service, as friends and family gathered at David and Blackwell's house to share stories and support each other, Marcus watched Blackwell push his grandson on the elaborate swing set that had become the center of the neighborhood's social life. Richard was laughing as he soared through the air, trusting completely in his grandfather's ability to keep him safe. "Hiya, Grandpa Richard," the little boy called out. "Make me fly like the fire trucks." And for a moment, watching a man who had spent 30 years running from his responsibilities learn to embrace the joy of being exactly where he belonged, Marcus believed that maybe all of them could learn to fly.